Sometimes a man's greatest failure becomes his last chance at redemption. When 67-year-old Silas Ward returns to his cattle ranch after months away, he expects to find his affairs in order and his men keeping the peace. Instead, he discovers a frightened young girl locked in his cellar. His foreman claims she's a thief, caught stealing food from the kitchen. But Silas sees something in her eyes that reminds him of his own lost daughter, a mix of terror and defiance that speaks to deeper wounds. Ruth refuses to speak, but her silence tells a story louder than words. As Silas digs into her past, he uncovers a web of broken promises stretching back decades. The girl isn't a criminal, she's the rightful heir to land his family stole from hers. But can an old man's conscience overcome a lifetime of looking the other way? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust from Silas Ward's wagon had barely settled when Jake Morrison appeared on the porch, his weathered face creased with what might have been relief or annoyance. Hard to tell with Jake. The man's expressions had grown as unreadable as winter clouds over the years. "Boss!" Jake called out, tipping his hat with practiced deference. "Wasn't expecting you back so soon." Silas climbed down from his wagon with the deliberate movements of a man whose bones remembered too many hard days. At 67, he still carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, though the years had carved deep lines around his eyes and silvered what remained of his dark hair. His clothes spoke of modest prosperity, well-made but practical, the kind worn by a man who valued function over fashion. "Business in Denver finished earlier than expected," Silas replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "How are things here?" "Quiet as usual. Cattle are doing well. Had some trouble with rustlers last month, but we ran them off." Jake's eyes shifted slightly, a tell Silas had noticed but never questioned. "Everything's been running smooth. The Ward Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of Montana territory, a kingdom of grassland and rolling hills that Silas's father had claimed and expanded through methods that seemed simpler in those days. The main house stood solid and unadorned, 2 stories of hewn logs and stone, built to withstand harsh winters rather than impress visitors. Outbuildings dotted the landscape. Barns, bunkhouses, a blacksmith shop, and various storage sheds that housed the machinery of a working ranch. Silas had inherited more than land from his father. He'd inherited a reputation as a fair but firm employer, a man who paid his debts and expected the same from others. The local townspeople in Cedar Flats respected him, though they kept their distance. Respect and warmth weren't the same thing, a lesson Silas had learned too late in life. "I'll want to review the books tonight," Silas said, untying his travel bag from the wagon, "and check on the herd tomorrow." "Course, boss." Tom's got everything written down neat as always. Tom Brady had served as the ranch's bookkeeper for over 20 years, a quiet man with steady hands and a head for numbers. Unlike Jake, Tom's loyalty had never been in question. Where Jake Morrison commanded through force of personality and occasional intimidation, Tom Brady earned respect through competence and reliability. As Silas walked toward the house, he noticed the subtle changes that accumulated during his absence. The porch railing needed repair. Weeds had crept closer to the foundation. The shutters on the upper windows hung slightly askew. A working ranch demanded constant attention, and Silas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. Inside, the house felt hollow in the way that empty houses do. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, had left everything clean and organized before taking her monthly leave to visit her sister in Billings. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the bread she'd baked before departing. The parlor furniture sat arranged precisely as his late wife had preferred, though dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Silas set his bag down and moved through the familiar rooms, each one holding memories he'd learned to carry without letting them cripple him. In the study, his wife's Bible still rested on the small table beside the window where she used to sit and read each morning. The leather binding had darkened with age and wear, and pressed flowers, collected during their early years of marriage, still marked passages she'd found meaningful. He picked up the Bible, feeling its familiar weight. Margaret had been gone, 8 years now, claimed by the fever that swept through the territory one brutal winter. She'd faced death with the same quiet strength she'd brought to life, holding his hand and making him promise to find their daughter, Emma, the wound that never quite healed. Emma had vanished 3 years before Margaret's death, disappearing one autumn night without explanation or farewell. She'd been 22 then, spirited and idealistic in the way of young people who believe they can remake the world through pure intention. She'd argued with Silas increasingly in those final months, though he could never quite grasp what had sparked her anger. "You don't see what's right in front of you, Papa," she'd said during their last conversation. "You don't see the hurt you've caused." He'd dismissed her words as youthful dramatics. Young people often felt everything too deeply, saw injustice where experience recognized the simple complexities of life. He'd expected her to outgrow such intensity, to settle into the practical wisdom that came with age. Instead, she'd left. No note, no goodbye. Just an empty room and clothes missing from her wardrobe. Silas had searched for months, hired investigators, followed every whisper of information. The trail had gone cold somewhere near the territorial border, and after 2 years of fruitless searching, he'd forced himself to accept what logic suggested. Emma was either dead or so determined to remain hidden that she might as well be. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted his brooding. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame. "Boss, we got that situation in the cellar." "The girl." "What girl?" "The one we caught stealing. Been keeping her locked up till you got back. Figured you'd want to decide what to do with her." Something cold settled in Silas's stomach. "Stealing what?" "Food, mostly. Bread from the kitchen, some dried meat. Tom caught her red-handed night before last. And you've had her locked in the cellar since then? Seemed the safest place. She's wild, that one. Tried to bite Tom when he grabbed her." Silas set the Bible down carefully, his movements controlled, despite the anger building in his chest. "Show me." They walked to the cellar entrance behind the main house, Jake producing a heavy key from his vest pocket. The wooden door sat flush with the ground, designed originally for storing root vegetables and preserved goods during the harsh winters. It had never been intended as a prison. Jake unlocked the door and pulled it open. Sunlight streamed down wooden steps into the earthen space below. In the far corner, a small figure huddled against the stone foundation. "Come on up, girl," Jake called. "Boss wants a look at you." Silas descended the steps instead, ignoring Jake's muttered protests. The cellar smelled of damp earth and fear. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could make out more details. The girl appeared to be perhaps 12 or 13, though malnutrition made it difficult to judge. Her dark skin bore the evidence of rough treatment, bruises on her arms, scratches on her face. Her dress was torn and dirty, but it had once been well made. Most striking were her eyes. Large and dark, they held a mixture of terror and defiance that cut straight through Silas's chest. Emma had worn that same expression during their final argument, the look of someone who saw injustice clearly and refused to pretend otherwise. "What's your name, child?" Silas asked gently, crouching down to her level. The girl pressed herself further into the corner, saying nothing. "Are you hurt? Besides what I can see?" Still no response, but her eyes tracked his movements with sharp intelligence. "Jake," Silas called up the stairs, "bring some water, and see if Mrs. Patterson left any bread." "Boss, she's just a thief. No point coddling. Bring the water, Jake." When Jake's footsteps faded, Silas settled onto an overturned crate and studied the girl more carefully. Her silence felt deliberate, rather than fearful, as if she'd made a conscious choice not to speak. Her posture suggested someone accustomed to hardship, but not broken by it. "I'm Silas Ward," he said. "This is my ranch. I've been away, or I would have handled this differently." A flicker of something, Surprise, perhaps, crossed her features. "I don't know what brought you here, but keeping you locked up like an animal isn't right. We'll get you cleaned up, fed properly, and then we'll figure out what to do." Jake returned, with a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread, his disapproval evident in every movement. "She probably can't even understand English proper," he muttered. "These people—" "That's enough, Jake." Silas poured water into a tin cup and offered it to the girl. She hesitated, then took it with both hands and drank deeply. When he held out a piece of bread, she accepted it, but ate slowly, watching him with those unsettling eyes. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked again. This time she spoke. Her voice was hoarse from thirst and disuse, but her words were clear and properly pronounced. "Ruth. Ruth. That's a fine name. Can you tell me where you come from, Ruth?" She shook her head, but Silas sensed she was refusing rather than indicating ignorance. "Well then, Ruth, let's get you out of this cellar and somewhere proper." As they climbed the steps back into daylight, Silas noticed Jake's expression had darkened considerably. The foreman clearly viewed this show of mercy as a mistake, possibly a dangerous one. In Jake's world, thieves were punished, not coddled. Weakness invited more trouble. But Silas had learned something important during his years of searching for Emma. Sometimes the people who appeared to be causing trouble were actually trying to solve it. And sometimes the real criminals wore familiar faces and spoke with trusted voices. Looking at Ruth now, standing blinking in the afternoon sun with her torn dress and defiant eyes, Silas felt an echo of recognition that went deeper than mere sympathy. This girl had seen something, or knew something that someone didn't want revealed. Her presence here wasn't random, and her treatment suggested someone wanted her silenced rather than punished. The question was what she knew, and who was afraid of her telling it. As they walked toward the house, Silas glanced back at Jake Morrison and caught an expression on his foreman's face that he'd never noticed before. A cold calculation that had nothing to do with ranch business and everything to do with covering tracks that Silas was only beginning to realize might exist. The bath. Water had turned gray by the time Ruth emerged from the kitchen washroom, but the transformation was remarkable. Clean and dressed in one of Emma's old dresses, hastily altered by Silas's unpracticed hands, she looked like what she was. A young girl who'd been through hell but hadn't been broken by it. Mrs. Patterson had returned from her visit that morning, and her maternal instincts had taken immediate precedence over any questions about why there was a strange child in the house. She'd fed Ruth properly, tended to her cuts and bruises, and somehow managed to coax a few more words from her in the process. "She's well-spoken when she does talk," Mrs. Patterson reported to Silas as they watched Ruth eat her second helping of beef stew. "And she's got manners. This isn't some wild child, Mr. Ward. She's been raised proper." Silas nodded, studying Ruth as she ate. Her table manners were indeed impeccable, and when she thought no one was watching, her posture relaxed into something almost regal. This was a girl accustomed to dignity, not desperation. "Ruth," he said gently, "I'd like to understand how you came to be here. If you're running from something or someone, I need to know about it." She finished chewing slowly, then looked up at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "I came for what's mine. What's yours?" Instead of answering directly, Ruth reached into the folds of her dress, the same torn dress she'd been wearing, which Mrs. Patterson had cleaned and mended. From a hidden pocket, she withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. "My grandmother told me to keep this safe always," Ruth said, unwrapping the bundle carefully. "She said someday someone would try to say it wasn't real, but it is. She made me memorize every word." What she revealed was a piece of paper, yellowed and fragile with age, but still legible. Silas took it with careful hands, unfolding it slowly. As he read, his blood chilled. It was a deed dated 1858, signed by his father, Jeremiah Ward. The document granted ownership of 200 acres of prime grazing land that was currently part of the Ward Ranch, to one Sarah Jenkins. In recognition of faithful service, and as partial compensation for services rendered during the establishment of said ranch. But it was the description of the land that made Silas's hands tremble. He knew every acre of his property, could walk the boundaries blindfolded. The parcel described in the deed encompassed some of the richest pasture land on the entire ranch, including the creek that provided water for nearly half their cattle. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was my grandmother's. Sarah Jenkins was my grandmother." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. He remembered Sarah Jenkins, though he'd been just a boy when she worked for the family. A tall, dignified woman who'd cooked and cleaned and somehow managed to run the household with quiet efficiency. She'd been kind to him, he recalled, always ready with a biscuit or a gentle word when his father's temper ran hot. "I remember her," Silas said, "but she never owned any land. My father never—" "Your father promised her," Ruth interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "She worked for your family for 15 years, from when she was 16 until she was over 30. When she wanted to marry my grandfather, your father said he'd give her land to start her own place, said it was only right after all she'd done." Silas stared at the deed, his mind racing. His father had been a hard man, practical to the point of cruelty sometimes, but he'd also had a code. He honored his debts and kept his word, even when it cost him. "What happened?" Silas asked. "She waited," Ruth said simply. "She and my grandfather built a little cabin on the land, started working it. They had my mother there. For 3 years they lived like it was theirs, because your father said it was. Then one day your father came with the sheriff and said they were trespassing. Said he'd never promised any land to anybody." The story had the ring of truth, but it made no sense. Silas tried to remember that time period, but he'd been away at school back east during much of the late 1850s and early 1860s. By the time he'd returned to help run the ranch, Sarah Jenkins was just a memory. "If she had this deed," Silas said, holding up the document, "why didn't she show it to the sheriff?" "She tried, but your father had friends, and my grandmother was a black woman with a piece of paper. The sheriff said it could be forged. Said anyone could write up something like that." The bitter truth of it settled in Silas's chest like a stone. He could imagine the scene all too clearly. Sarah Jenkins standing before the sheriff with her proof, facing men who'd already decided not to believe her, regardless of what evidence she presented. So they left? They had to. "But my grandmother kept the deed. She said someday people would be ready to see the truth, and when that day came, our family would claim what was ours." Mrs. Patterson had stopped pretending to busy herself with kitchen tasks and was listening openly now, her face pale with shock. The implications of Ruth's story were staggering, not just the moral weight of the injustice, but the legal ramifications if the deed proved authentic. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted the heavy silence. Jake Morrison's voice called out from the front door. "Boss, need to talk to you about the girl." Silas quickly folded the deed and handed it back to Ruth, who wrapped it carefully and tucked it away again. "Not a word about this," he murmured. "Not yet." Ruth nodded, understanding instinctively that danger surrounded her revelation. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes immediately fixing on Ruth with an expression that made Silas's spine stiffen. There was recognition there, and something else. Fear. "She cleaned up nice," Jake said, but his tone suggested the opposite of approval. "Look, boss, I've been thinking. Maybe we should take her into town, let the sheriff sort this out. Can't have vagrant children wandering around stealing food. Sets a bad precedent." "She's not going anywhere until I understand the full situation," Silas replied firmly. What's to understand? She's a thief. We caught her stealing. End of story." "Is it?" Silas stood, using his full height to advantage. "Because I'm starting to think there might be more to this story than you've told me." Jake's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Not sure what you mean, boss. I mean that this girl didn't just wander onto my property by accident. She came here for a specific reason, and I intend to find out what that reason is." "You're making a mistake," Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Some people, you show them kindness, and they see weakness. They take advantage. Are you telling me how to run my ranch, Jake? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about authority and loyalty. Jake Morrison had been foreman for 8 years, and in that time he'd taken increasing liberties with decision-making. Silas had allowed it, partly from grief-induced distraction, and partly because Jake seemed competent. But now he wondered what other decisions Jake had made without consultation. "Course not, boss," Jake replied, but his eyes remained cold. "Just looking out for the ranch's interests. Then we understand each other. Ruth stays until I say otherwise." After Jake left, Silas returned to his study and sat heavily in his father's old chair. The weight of what Ruth had told him pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. If her story was true, and the deed certainly appeared authentic, then his family had committed a terrible injustice. More than that, they'd stolen land that rightfully belonged to someone else. But it raised other questions too. If Jake Morrison recognized Ruth, as his expression suggested, then how was he involved? And why had Ruth chosen now to come forward with her claim? Silas opened his father's desk and began searching through the old papers stored there. Jeremiah Ward had been meticulous about record-keeping, and if he'd truly made an agreement with Sarah Jenkins, there should be some trace of it. What he found, buried beneath account ledgers and cattle inventories, was a letter in his father's handwriting. It was addressed to no one, apparently a draft that had never been sent. "The Jenkins matter weighs heavy on my conscience," it read. "I gave my word, and a man's word should be his bond. But the pressures of the drought year have made it impossible to honor the original agreement. I pray that someday circumstances will allow me to make amends for this failure of character." The letter was dated 3 months before his father's death from a heart attack. Silas read it 3 times, each reading making the truth clearer and more damning. His father had indeed promised Sarah Jenkins that land, and his father had broken that promise when financial pressures made it inconvenient to honor. The knowledge sat in Silas's stomach like spoiled meat. His father hadn't been the man Silas had believed him to be. Or perhaps he'd been exactly that man, someone who made grand gestures when they cost him nothing and abandoned his principles when honoring them became difficult. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Ruth stood in the doorway, no longer looking. Like a frightened child, but like someone carrying the weight of generations. "Mr. Ward, I know you found something. I can see it in your face." Silas held up the letter. "My father wrote this before he died. He admitted what he'd done to your grandmother." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Will you help me?" The question was simple, but Silas understood its complexity. Helping Ruth would mean more than just acknowledging the truth. It would mean confronting Jake Morrison and anyone else who might be involved in keeping that truth buried. It would mean admitting that the prosperity he'd inherited was built partially on theft. Most importantly, it would mean doing something his father had failed to do when it mattered most. "Yes," Silas said. "I'll help you claim what's rightfully yours." Ruth's smile was like sunrise after a long night. But as Silas looked past her, toward the window, he could see Jake Morrison talking intensely with 2 of the ranch hands near the barn. Their body language suggested conspiracy, not casual conversation. Whatever came next, Silas realized, it wasn't going to be simple. The ranch records ledger had been gathering dust on the highest shelf of Silas's study for years. He'd pulled it down after Ruth retired for the night, determined to find whatever evidence might exist to support her claims. The leather-bound book was thick and heavy, filled with his father's meticulous handwriting, documenting every transaction, every employee, every significant event from 1855 to 1872. Silas lit 2 oil lamps and settled in for a long night of reading. The pages crackled as he turned them, releasing the musty scent of old paper and dried ink. His father had recorded everything: payments to workers, purchases of equipment, sales of cattle. Even the weather patterns that affected grazing conditions, the entries for 1858, were particularly detailed, as if Jeremiah Ward had anticipated future scrutiny. Silas found the first mention of Sarah Jenkins in March of that year. Hired S. Jenkins as housekeeper and cook, wages $8 per month plus board. But it was the entries from later that year that made Silas's pulse quicken. In September, his father had written, discussed future arrangements with S. Jenkins, promised parcel of land along Willow Creek in recognition of exceptional service. Will prepare proper documentation. October brought more details. S. Jenkins' marriage to Thomas Jenkins. Approved. Will honor commitment to provide homestead land as discussed. Creek access essential for their success. Then in November, a chilling entry. Drought conditions worse than anticipated. Cattle losses mounting. Cannot afford to give up prime creek access. Must reconsider Jenkins' arrangement. The final entry about Sarah Jenkins came in December. Informed Jenkins that land grant cannot proceed as planned. Offered additional monetary compensation instead. She refused and demanded fulfillment of original promise. Situation becoming difficult. After that, Sarah Jenkins disappeared from the records entirely, as if she'd never existed. Silas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The ledger confirmed Ruth's story in damning detail. His father had indeed promised Sarah Jenkins land, had even acknowledged the promise in writing, then had broken his word when circumstances made it inconvenient to honor. But there was more. As Silas continued reading, he discovered a pattern of payments to various individuals that made no sense in the context of ranch operations. Monthly payments of $5 to someone identified only as J.M., beginning in 1859 and continuing sporadically. For years, the amounts varied, sometimes reaching as high as $20, but they appeared consistently enough to suggest an ongoing arrangement. J.M. could be Jake Morrison, though Jake claimed he'd only been working the ranch for 8 years. If these payments referred to him, then Jake had been lying about when he'd started, and the payments suggested something beyond normal wages. A soft knock on the study door interrupted his investigation. Mrs. Patterson peered in, holding a cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting the cup on his desk. "You've been at those books for hours." "Thank you, Martha." Silas accepted the coffee gratefully. "Tell me, do you remember Sarah Jenkins?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew thoughtful. "Before my time, but I heard stories. From what folks said, she was a fine woman, good cook, kept a clean house. There was some trouble when she left, but nobody ever spoke of it directly." "What kind of trouble?" "The sort that men don't discuss with their housekeepers," Mrs. Patterson replied diplomatically. "But I always heard your father regretted how things ended with her. Tom Brady might know more. He's been here longer than anyone." Tom Brady, Silas had forgotten that his bookkeeper had worked for the ranch since the early 1860s, starting as a young man just a few years after Sarah Jenkins left. If anyone knew the full story, it would be Tom. The next morning, Silas found Tom in the small office attached to the barn, bent over his ledgers with characteristic precision. Tom was a small, neat man in his 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance, despite his rough hands and sun-weathered face. "Tom, I need to ask you about something that happened before I took over the ranch. About Sarah Jenkins." Tom's pen stopped moving, though he didn't look up immediately. "That's going back a long way, Mr. Ward." "I know, but it's important." Tom set down his pen and removed his spectacles, cleaning them with careful deliberation. "What do you want to know? Was there truth to the story that my father promised her land?" "Yes," Tom said without hesitation. "Your father gave his word, and Sarah Jenkins believed him. She had every reason to." "Then why—" "Money," Tom interrupted. "The drought of 59 hit hard, and your father was stretched thin. Giving up prime grazing land would have meant smaller herds, reduced income. He chose the ranch over his promise. But he could have honored the commitment after things improved." Tom's expression grew complicated. By then, other factors had come into play. What factors? Tom glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. Jake Morrison showed up around that time. Young fellow with ideas about how to make the ranch more profitable. He convinced your father that honoring the promise to Sarah Jenkins would set a precedent, that other workers might expect similar treatment. The pieces were beginning to fit together in Silas's mind. Jake influenced my father's decision more than influenced. Jake had schemes for expanding the ranch, taking over smaller properties, consolidating land. Giving away 200 acres to a former employee didn't fit with those plans. And you kept quiet about this for all these years? Tom's shoulders sagged slightly. I was young, needed the job. And after your father died, what was the point? The damage was done. That afternoon, Silas found Ruth in the kitchen garden, helping Mrs. Patterson gather vegetables for dinner. She moved with unconscious grace, and watching her, Silas was struck again by her inherent dignity. This wasn't a child who'd grown up in poverty. She'd been raised with love and care, despite the injustices her family had suffered. "Ruth," he said gently, "I'd like to hear more about your family, about how you came to be here." She looked up from the tomato plants, considering his request. "My grandmother died 2 years ago. Before she passed, she made me promise to come here when I was old enough to understand what the deed meant. How did you make the journey?" "I worked my way here, helped families with their children, did washing and cooking. Most people were kind when they learned I was traveling alone. But not everyone." Ruth's expression darkened. "3 days ago, I finally reached the ranch. I was trying to figure out how to approach your house when some of your men found me. I tried to explain why I was here, but they wouldn't listen." "What exactly did you tell them?" "I said I was Sarah Jenkins' granddaughter, and that I had papers proving my family owned land here." "The big man, Jake Morrison?" "Yes." He laughed and said my grandmother was nothing but a lying thief, and now I was following in her footsteps. When I tried to show him the deed, he grabbed it from me. I had to fight to get it back." Silas felt anger building in his chest. He tried to take the deed. He would have destroyed it if I hadn't scratched his face and run. But they caught me later when I came back to try again. The picture was becoming clearer. Jake Morrison knew exactly who Ruth was and what she represented. Her arrival threatened not just the current land arrangements, but possibly other questionable dealings Jake had been involved with over the years. "Ruth, when you spoke to Jake, did he seem surprised to learn who you were?" She shook her head. "No, it was like he'd been expecting me." That evening, as Silas sat in his study reviewing everything he'd learned, he heard voices outside, Jake Morrison talking with several of the ranch hands. Their conversation was too muffled to make out words, but the tone was urgent, conspiratorial. Silas moved to the window and peered through the curtains. Jake stood in the center of a group that included most of the senior hands. Their body language suggested heated discussion, and more than once Jake pointed toward the main house. Whatever Jake was planning, Silas realized, it was happening soon. The foreman had spent years building loyalty among the ranch hands, positioning himself as their advocate against an absent owner. Now that Silas had returned and begun asking uncomfortable questions, Jake would need to act before his position became untenable. As if sensing scrutiny, Jake looked up toward the house. Even in the dim light, Silas could see the cold calculation in his foreman's eyes. This wasn't just about Ruth's land claim anymore. It was about power, control, and the secrets that Jake Morrison had been keeping. The old ranch records ledger lay open on Silas's desk, its pages documenting decades of hidden truths. As Silas closed the book, he understood that the real reckoning was just beginning. Jake Morrison had been running his own version of the Ward Ranch for years, and he wouldn't give up that control without a fight. The question now was whether Silas had the strength and courage to finish what his father had failed to complete, restoring honor to the Ward name by making right the wrongs of the past, regardless of the cost. The secret compartment in Jeremiah Ward's desk had been so well concealed that Silas might never have found it if desperation hadn't driven him to examine every inch of the old roll-top. A hidden spring mechanism revealed a narrow space behind the main drawer, and within that space lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was careful and precise, though the paper had yellowed with age. Each letter was addressed to Mr. Jeremiah Ward and signed, "Your faithful servant, Sarah Jenkins." The postmark spanned nearly 2 years, from late 1858 through the summer of 1860. Silas's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. Sarah's words, written in a clear, educated hand, transported him back to a time when promises still meant something and hope hadn't yet been crushed by expedience. "Dear Mr. Ward," the first letter began, "I write to thank you again for your generous promise regarding the land along Willow Creek. Thomas and I have walked the boundaries you described, and we can envision the life we hope to build there. The soil is rich, and the creek runs clear and strong. We have already begun planning where to place our cabin and how to lay out the fields for crops." The early letters were filled with optimism and gratitude. Sarah wrote about her marriage. To Thomas Jenkins, about their dreams of raising children on land they could call their own. She described small improvements they'd made to the property, fences mended and wild areas cleared, all done with the understanding that this would someday be their home. But as Silas continued reading, the tone gradually shifted. "Dear Mr. Ward," began a letter dated 6 months later. "I hope this letter finds you well. Thomas and I have heard whispers that there may be some question about our claim to the creek land. I'm certain these are just rumors spread by folks who envy our good fortune, but I thought it best to address the matter directly. We have your word, and that has always been enough for us." The middle letters revealed growing anxiety. Sarah wrote about conversations with other ranch hands who suggested she was getting above herself by believing she could own land. She mentioned Jake Morrison by name, describing how he'd warned her that certain people were questioning whether promises made to her kind needed to be honored. It was the final letters that broke Silas's heart completely. "Mr. Ward," one letter read, "I beg you to remember the years I gave to your family. I raised your son when you were away on business. I nursed your wife through her difficult pregnancy. I kept your house running when the ranch demanded all your attention. I never asked for more than fair wages and respectful treatment, but when you offered the land, I believed you meant it. Thomas and I have put our lives on hold, waiting for you to prepare the deed as you promised. Please, sir, if you have any regard for the service I provided, honor your word." The last letter was the most devastating. "Mr. Ward, the sheriff came today and told us we must leave the creek land immediately. He said you deny ever making any promise to us and that we are trespassing on Ward Ranch property. I know there must be some mistake. You are a man of honor and your word is your bond. I'm sending this letter with the hope that you will clarify the situation and instruct the sheriff that we have every right to be where we are. Thomas has already begun building our cabin, and I am with child. Please, sir, do not abandon us." Now, when we need your integrity most, there was no response letter in Jeremiah Ward's handwriting, only a brief notation on the back of the final envelope. No reply sent. Matter closed. Silas sat back in his chair, feeling physically ill. His father hadn't just broken a promise. He'd deliberately destroyed the lives of people who had trusted him completely. Sarah Jenkins had given her youth and devotion to the Ward family, and in return she'd been branded a liar and cast out like a criminal. A soft knock interrupted his anguish. Ruth stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Ward, Mrs. Patterson said you'd been in here all day. She's worried about you." Silas looked up at her, this poised young woman who carried herself with such dignity despite everything her family had endured, and felt the full weight of his inheritance of shame. "Ruth," he said quietly, "I found your grandmother's letters to my father." Her eyes widened. Her letters! She wrote to him for 2 years, pleading with him to honor his promise. The letters show exactly what kind of woman she was: educated, dignified, faithful to her word. Everything you said about her was true. Ruth moved closer, her composure beginning to crack. Could I hear what she wrote? Silas nodded and began reading from the letters, starting with the hopeful early ones and progressing through the growing desperation of the later correspondence. As he read aloud the final letter, Sarah's plea not to be abandoned when she was pregnant and vulnerable, Ruth's tears began to fall. "She never told me how hard she fought," Ruth whispered. "She always said your father was a good man who'd been led astray by bad advisors. Even after everything, she didn't want me to hate him." "She was a better person than he deserved," Silas replied. "Better than any of us deserved. She died believing that someday justice would come. She made me promise to be patient, to wait for the right time, to approach with respect rather than anger." Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She said hatred poisoned the soul, and she wouldn't let what happened to her poison mine." The depth of Sarah Jenkins's grace in the face of such betrayal humbled Silas completely. Here was a woman who had been robbed, lied about, and cast out, yet she'd raised her granddaughter to seek justice rather than revenge. "Ruth, I give you my word, not the word of a ward, which has been proven worthless, but my word as a man trying. To live with honor, I will restore your family's land to you." Before Ruth could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway without knocking, his face flushed with anger. "Boss, we need to talk. The men are getting restless about this situation." "What situation, Jake?" "This whole business with the girl. Word's getting around about what you're doing, and folks don't like it. You start giving land away to every vagrant who shows up with a sob story, and soon we'll have half the territory camping on Ward property, claiming they're owed something." Silas stood slowly, using his full height to advantage. "Are you suggesting I'm making a mistake in my own house, on my own land? I'm suggesting you're being taken advantage of by people who know how to manipulate a kind heart," Jake replied, his tone growing more aggressive. "This girl's got you twisted around her. Finger with some story about her grandmother. Even if there's some truth to it, that was decades ago. Water under the bridge." "Water under the bridge." Silas's voice rose. "A woman who served my family faithfully was cheated out of land she was promised. Her family has lived in poverty for generations because of my father's broken word. That's not water under a bridge. That's a debt that needs to be paid." Jake's expression darkened. "You pay that debt and you'll open the floodgates. Every ranch hand who ever got fired, every drifter who ever worked a season, they'll all come back claiming they were promised something. Is that what you want?" "What I want," Silas said firmly, "is to restore honor to the Ward name." "Honor?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Boss, you're living in the past. This is 1882. Not 1860. The world's moved on, and so should you. Get out of my house, Jake." "What?" "You heard me. Get out. And don't come back until you can speak to me with the respect due to your employer." Jake's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally calculation. "You're making a mistake, boss, bigger than you know. The men depend on this ranch for their livelihoods. They won't stand by and watch you destroy everything over some misguided guilt about ancient history." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. You've been away too long. You don't know how things work anymore. I've been keeping this ranch running, keeping the men in line, making the hard decisions you weren't here to make. You want to throw that away over this girl's fairy tale. That's your choice. But don't expect the rest of us to go down with you." After Jake left, Ruth moved to the window and watched him stride toward the bunkhouse. "He's gathering them," she said quietly. "The men. He's going to turn them against you." Silas joined her at the window. Sure enough, Jake was already talking animatedly to a group of ranch hands, his gestures emphatic and his face red with apparent righteous indignation. "He's been building loyalty among them for years," Silas mused, "probably positioning himself as their advocate against an absent owner. Now that I'm back and threatening his position, he'll use that loyalty to protect himself." "What will you do?" Silas looked down at the letters still scattered across his desk, eloquent testimony to his family's failure and Sarah Jenkins's grace. Then he looked at Ruth, who stood straight and dignified despite the storm gathering around them. "I'll do what my father should have done 40 years ago," he said. "I'll honor his promise, no matter what it costs." Through the window they could see Jake Morrison's animated conversation with the ranch hands growing more intense. Several men were nodding agreement with whatever he was telling them, while others looked uncertain but not openly opposed. "They're scared," Ruth observed. "Not of you, of change. Jake Morrison represents security to them, even if that security is built on lies." "Then we'll have to show them that truth is more secure than lies," Silas replied. "Even when truth is harder to live with." As darkness fell and the group around Jake Morrison finally dispersed, Silas gathered Sarah's letters and placed them carefully in his desk drawer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he suspected Jake Morrison would not be content with mere verbal opposition. But tonight he had Ruth's presence and the weight of Sarah Jenkins's words to give him strength. A woman who had been betrayed by his family had still raised her granddaughter to seek justice rather than revenge. The least Silas could do was prove worthy of that grace. The music box had been silent for 3 years, gathering dust on the mantelpiece in Emma's old room. Silas hadn't entered that room since shortly after her disappearance, when the painful hope of her return had finally given way to resigned acceptance. But something about Ruth's presence in the house had drawn him back to that space filled with memories. The room remained exactly as Emma had left it. Her dresses still hung in the wardrobe, her books lay stacked on the bedside table, and the small music box, a gift for her 16th birthday, sat where she'd always kept it, next to the window that faced the creek. Silas picked up the delicate wooden box, its painted surface showing scenes of dancers in a pastoral setting. When he lifted the lid, the mechanism released its haunting melody. Amazing Grace played in the thin, crystalline notes that had once delighted his daughter. "That's beautiful," Ruth said from the doorway. She'd followed him upstairs after breakfast, perhaps sensing his need for company as he wrestled with old grief. "It was my daughter's," Silas replied, setting the music box down carefully. "Emma loved music. She had a voice like an angel." Ruth moved into the room with respectful curiosity, taking in the preserved space. "What was she like?" Silas settled into the chair by the window, Emma's favorite spot for reading, and gestured for Ruth to sit on the bed. "She was like you, in many ways, strong-willed, intelligent, unwilling to accept injustice without fighting it. Is that why she left?" The directness of the question caught Silas off guard, but he recognized that Ruth deserved honesty. "I think so. We argued in those final months before she disappeared. She kept saying I didn't see the hurt I was causing, that I was blind to what was happening right in front of me." "What kind of hurt?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, listening to the creek flowing beyond the window. "I was so focused on running the ranch, on maintaining what my father had built, that I didn't pay attention to how that legacy was affecting other people. Emma saw things I chose to ignore." Ruth picked up a book from Emma's collection, a volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. "My grandmother used to say that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones brave enough to tell us difficult truths. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Even after everything that happened to her here, she never spoke with bitterness about your family. She said your father was a good man who made a bad choice, and that bad choices could be unmade if people had enough courage. "Tell me about her, about your family." Ruth's eyes grew distant as she remembered. "My grandmother worked as a seamstress after she left here. She was skilled with her hands, could make beautiful dresses and quilts. My grandfather did carpentry work. He built furniture that people treasured for generations. They were proud. People who believed in earning their way through honest work. And your parents? My mother inherited my grandmother's skill with sewing. She married a teacher, my father. He taught children to read and write in a small school for colored children. They died in the influenza epidemic 5 years ago. Ruth's voice remained steady, but Silas could see the pain beneath her composure. I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. My grandmother took me in without question. She'd already raised my mother alone after my grandfather died young, and she raised me the same way, with love and the expectation that I would be better than the circumstances that surrounded me. The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Silas could see Jake Morrison returning from what was supposed to be a routine patrol of the northern pastures. But something was wrong with the picture. Jake was driving a small group of cattle that Silas didn't recognize, and he was accompanied by two men who weren't Ward Ranch employees. That's odd, Silas murmured, standing for a better view. Ruth joined him at the window. Those aren't your cattle. How can you tell? The brands. I learned to read brands when I was little. It was a game my grandfather taught me. Those cattle are carrying the Double R brand. Silas knew the Double R brand belonged to Richard Reeves, a smaller rancher whose property lay about 20 miles to the east. The brands were fresh, recently applied, which suggested the cattle had been rebranded to conceal their original ownership. Stay here, Silas instructed Ruth. I need to see what this is about. He made his way downstairs and out to the yard, arriving just as Jake and his companions were driving the cattle into one of the holding corrals. Jake's expression was casual, as if this were routine business, but the two strangers looked nervous. "Jake," Silas called out, "where did these cattle come from?" "Found them wandering near the creek," Jake replied smoothly. "Strays, looked like. Figured we'd better bring them in before they caused trouble." Silas examined the cattle more closely. They were healthy animals, well-fed, and clearly not strays that had been wandering unattended. The Double R brands were, indeed, fresh, applied over what appeared to be older markings that had been burned away. "These cattle belong to Richard Reeves," Silas said. "Not anymore," one of the strangers muttered, then caught Jake's warning glare. "What my friend means," Jake said quickly, "is that we bought them fair and square. Got the papers right here." He produced a bill of sale from his vest pocket. Silas examined the document. It appeared legitimate on the surface, but something about it felt wrong. The signature was shaky, and the paper looked artificially aged. "When did this transaction take place?" "Yesterday. Reeves needed cash quick, was willing to sell below market value." Silas knew Richard Reeves well enough to know the man would never sell quality cattle at below market prices unless he was desperate, and Reeves had never mentioned financial difficulties during their occasional encounters in town. "I think I'll ride over and thank Richard for the good price," Silas said, watching Jake's reaction carefully. For just a moment, Jake's composed mask slipped, revealing something that looked like panic. "No need for that, boss. Man's got his pride. Might embarrass him to have you mention his money troubles. Nevertheless, I think it's the neighborly thing to do." After Jake and his companions departed with obvious reluctance, Silas returned to the house to find Ruth waiting in the kitchen with Mrs. Patterson. Both women wore expressions of concern. "Those men were lying," Ruth said immediately. "I could tell from their faces." "I'm beginning to think Jake Morrison has been conducting business that has nothing to do with legitimate ranch operations," Silas replied. "The question is how extensive his activities have been." Mrs. Patterson set down her mixing bowl with unusual force. "I've wondered about some of the men Jake's brought around lately. Rough types who don't look like honest ranch hands. And there've been times when I've seen lights in the barn late at night like someone's conducting meetings." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Wasn't my place to question the foreman's business, but now that you're asking direct questions." She paused, then continued. "There was one night last month when I heard Jake talking to someone about moving the merchandise before the moon's full. Didn't make sense as ranch talk." Silas felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align. Jake Morrison wasn't just corrupt, he was likely running a cattle-rustling operation using the Ward Ranch as his base. The isolated location, the trust Silas had placed in him, the loyalty, he'd built among certain ranch hands. It all provided perfect cover for criminal activities. "Ruth," Silas said, "I want you to stay close to the house for the next few days. Don't wander around the property alone. You think I'm in danger? I think anyone who threatens Jake Morrison's operation is in danger, and your presence here, your claim to the land, that threatens more than just his control over ranch decisions." That evening, as Silas sat in his study planning his next moves, Ruth knocked on the door and entered carrying the music box from Emma's room. "I thought you might like to have this with you," she said, setting it on his desk. "Sometimes when my grandmother was worried about difficult decisions, she'd listen to hymns. Said they reminded her that there were things more important than whatever trouble she was facing." Silas lifted the lid and let the gentle melody fill the room. "Amazing Grace" had been Emma's favorite hymn, and hearing it now brought back memories of Sunday mornings when she was young, her clear voice rising above the congregation. "Your daughter would be proud of what you're doing," Ruth said quietly, "standing up for what's right even when it's difficult." "I hope so. I failed her when she needed me to see clearly. I won't make that mistake again." Ruth settled into the chair across from his desk, her posture reflecting a maturity that belied her years. "My grandmother used to say that we can't change the past, but we can honor it by choosing differently in the present." As the music box played its haunting melody, Silas realized that Ruth had brought him more than just a land claim to resolve. She'd brought him a chance at redemption, not just for his father's failures, but for his own blindness to the injustices that had flourished under his inattention. Tomorrow, he would ride to Richard Reeves's ranch and learn the truth about those cattle. Tonight, he would listen to his daughter's music and draw strength from the wisdom of a young woman who carried herself with the grace her grandmother had taught her to embody. The ride to Richard Reeves's ranch confirmed Silas's worst suspicions. He found Reeves nursing a broken arm and nursing an even deeper sense of betrayal. The cattle hadn't been sold. They'd been stolen at gunpoint by 3 men who'd threatened to burn down his house if he reported the theft to the sheriff. "One of them knew things about my property that only someone who'd scouted it carefully would know," Reeves explained, wincing as he adjusted his sling. "They knew exactly how many head I kept in the north pasture, knew which trails I used to move them. This wasn't random rustling. It was planned." "Did you recognize any of them?" "The leader was someone I'd seen before, though I couldn't place where. Big man with a scar along his jaw. The other 2 were strangers, but they followed his orders like they were used to working together." Silas knew that description could fit Jake Morrison, though he'd never noticed a scar. But scars could be hidden, and Jake had been away from the ranch often enough lately to scout neighboring properties. "Richard, I have reason to believe my foreman might be involved in this. I'm going to get your cattle back and see that justice is done." "Be careful, Silas. These men weren't just thieves, they were killers. I could see it in their eyes. They would have shot me down without a second thought if I'd given them cause." The ride back to the Ward ranch gave Silas time to think. If Jake Morrison was indeed running a rustling operation, he wouldn't be storing stolen cattle in the open corrals where they might be seen by legitimate visitors. There had to be a hidden location somewhere on the vast ranch property, a place where cattle could be kept temporarily while their brands were altered and buyers were found. As he approached the ranch buildings, Silas noticed unusual activity near the old mining claim his father had briefly worked in the 1860s. The mine had played out quickly, leaving behind a network of shafts and storage areas that had been abandoned for over a decade. It would be the perfect location for illegal activities. Instead of returning directly to the house, Silas circled around through the pine woods that screened the mine area from view. What he found there made his blood run cold. A well-organized operation occupied the abandoned mine site. Temporary corrals held at least 50 head of cattle, bearing a variety of brands, all recently altered. A blacksmith's forge had been set up for changing brands, and several men worked methodically at the illegal task. Jake Morrison stood in the center of it all, directing operations like a military commander. But it wasn't just the scale of the rustling operation that shocked Silas. It was the discovery of wooden crates stacked near the mine entrance. The crates bore official territorial markings and appeared to contain government supplies, possibly meant for military outposts or Indian reservations. Jake Morrison wasn't just stealing cattle, he was running a comprehensive criminal enterprise. Silas backed away carefully, but his retreat was blocked by the sound of approaching horses. Jake's voice carried clearly through the afternoon air as he spoke to someone Silas couldn't see. "Need to move faster. The old man's getting suspicious, and that girl's presence is making everything more complicated. We should have dealt with both of them when we had the chance." "What about the rest of the hands?" another voice asked. "Some of them might not go along with what you're planning. The ones that matter are already with us. The others, well, they'll have to make their choice when the time comes. Either they're part of the solution or they're part of the problem." Silas managed to slip away undetected, but Jake's words echoed in his mind as he rode back to the house. The foreman wasn't just planning to continue his criminal activities. He was preparing to eliminate anyone who threatened his operation. That clearly included both Silas and Ruth. He found Ruth in the kitchen garden, but instead of the peaceful scene he expected, she was pressed against the back wall of the root cellar, her face pale with fear. "What's wrong?" he asked, dismounting quickly. "Two men came looking for you about an hour ago," she whispered. "When Mrs. Patterson told them you weren't here, they started asking questions about me. Where I came from, how long I'd been here, whether I'd been talking to anyone in town. Did you recognize them? One of them was with Jake Morrison yesterday when he brought those cattle in. The other was a stranger, but he had mean eyes. They kept looking at me like they were trying to decide something." Mrs. Patterson appeared from the kitchen, her face grim. "I told them you'd gone to check on the cattle in the south pasture and wouldn't be back until evening, but they didn't believe me. They went to search your study." Silas felt anger surge through him. The violation of his home was bad enough, but threatening Ruth and Mrs. Patterson crossed a line that demanded immediate response. "What were they looking for in the study?" "Papers, seemed like. They went through your desk drawers and the file cabinets. I couldn't stop them without making things worse." In his study, Silas found evidence of a thorough search. Desk drawers had been rifled through, papers scattered, and books pulled from shelves. But the searchers had been careful not to damage anything irreparably. They didn't want their intrusion to be obvious. Most importantly, they hadn't found what Silas suspected they were looking for. Sarah Jenkins's letters and Ruth's deed were hidden in the secret compartment that had escaped detection. "They were looking for the deed," Ruth said from behind him, "and probably any other evidence that might support my claim. Which means, Jake, Morrison understands exactly what you represent. You're not just a threat to his version of recent events. You're a threat to the entire foundation of his power here." That evening, as darkness settled over the ranch, Silas made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He retrieved his father's old Colt revolver from the gun cabinet and checked to ensure it was properly loaded. Then he asked Mrs. Patterson to prepare enough food for several days and to pack it discreetly. "Are we leaving?" Ruth asked, noticing the preparations. "Not leaving, relocating temporarily. There's an old line cabin up in the hills that Jake Morrison doesn't know about. It'll give us a safe place to plan our next moves." "Why not just go to the sheriff?" Silas had considered that option, but Jake Morrison's confidence suggested he had allies beyond the ranch. Jake's been operating here for years, without detection. That suggests he either has the sheriff in his pocket or has convinced him that any accusations would come from unreliable sources. "You mean from me?" A young black girl with a questionable story against an established white foreman with a good reputation. In a territorial court, that's not a fair fight. Ruth's expression hardened with the bitter wisdom of someone who'd faced such realities before. "So, we have to prove his guilt beyond any doubt." "Exactly. And to do that, we need to find evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." As they prepared to leave for the line cabin, Silas took a final look around his study. The music box sat on his desk, its painted dancers frozen in their eternal waltz. He picked it up and tucked it carefully into his saddlebag. Emma's music would travel with them into whatever dangers lay ahead. "Mr. Ward," Ruth said quietly as they prepared to mount their horses, "my grandmother always said that when good people finally decide to fight evil, the evil never expects how strong good people can be." "Let's hope she was right," Silas replied, checking his revolver one more time. As they rode toward the hills under cover of darkness, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jake Morrison had spent years building his criminal empire, and he wouldn't let it collapse without a fight. The question was whether Silas and Ruth could gather enough evidence to expose him before he decided that eliminating them was the simpler solution. Behind them, the ranch lights grew distant, but Silas could see the glow from the mine area where Jake's operation continued under cover of night. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the willful blindness that had allowed such corruption to flourish. The old man who had returned from Denver just days ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood what his daughter had tried to tell him. Sometimes seeing clearly meant accepting that everything you thought you knew was built on lies. The line cabin sat in a clearing halfway up the mountainside, hidden by pine trees and accessible only by a narrow trail that Silas's father had carved out decades earlier. It had been built as shelter for hands working the high pastures, but it had been abandoned for years as the ranch's operations consolidated around the main buildings. Inside, the single room was sparse but functional. 2 narrow bunks, a stone fireplace, shelves for supplies, and a small table beneath the single window. Silas and Ruth had arrived well after midnight, exhausted from the careful ride through darkness, but the cabin felt safer than anywhere on the main ranch. As Ruth settled onto one of the bunks, she reached into her travel bag and withdrew something, wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Ward, there's something I haven't shown you. Something my grandmother made me promise to give to you personally if I ever found you." She unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image was faded but clear, a group of people standing in front of a modest cabin, smiling at the camera with the easy familiarity of family. Silas took the photograph with trembling hands, then nearly dropped it in shock. There, standing beside a woman who could only be Ruth's grandmother, was Emma, his daughter unmistakably alive and well, her arm around the shoulders of a young boy who bore a strong resemblance to Ruth. Where? How? Silas couldn't form complete words, his eyes fixed on Emma's face. She looked older in the photograph than when he'd last seen her, but there was something in her expression he'd never noticed before, a sense of peace, of purpose found. "She lived with us for almost 2 years, Ruth said gently. "She found our house when she was sick and had nowhere else to go. My grandmother took her in, nursed her back to health, and she became part of our family." Silas stared at the image, seeing his daughter truly happy in a way he'd never witnessed during her years at the ranch. "When was this taken?" "About 6 months before she died. She'd been helping my grandmother with sewing work, and she was teaching children to read at the school where my father worked. She was happy, Mr. Ward, maybe happier than she'd ever been." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. While he'd been searching desperately for Emma, hiring investigators and following false leads, she'd been living peacefully with the very family his own father had wronged. The irony was so complete, it seemed almost divinely orchestrated. "She talked about you," Ruth continued. "She said she'd left because she couldn't stand watching you repeat your father's mistakes, but she regretted the way she'd gone about it. She wanted to come back and make things right, but she was afraid you'd be angry. Angry? I would have given anything just to know she was alive. She knew that. Toward the end, when the fever took her, she made my grandmother promise to find you someday and tell you she'd forgiven you. She said she'd learned to understand that good people sometimes do wrong things because they can't see past their own pain." Silas studied the photograph through tears he didn't try to hide. Emma looked so young, so full of the life that had been cut short by disease. But she also looked like she'd found something she'd been searching for, a sense of belonging, of purpose. She learned about your grandmother's story, Ruth said, about the land promise and how my family had been treated. She said it explained so much about why she'd felt uncomfortable at the ranch, why she'd always sensed there were things people weren't talking about. What did she do with that knowledge? She started making inquiries. Quietly, carefully, she was trying to gather evidence to prove my grandmother's claim was legitimate. She said she wanted to come back to you with proof that would make it impossible to ignore the injustice. The pieces of Emma's final years began falling into place in Silas's mind. Her arguments with him, her accusations that he was blind to, the hurt he was causing, her insistence that there were wrongs that needed to be righted, it all made sense now. She hadn't been rebelling against him personally, she'd been trying to awaken his conscience. Did she find the evidence she was looking for? Ruth nodded toward a leather portfolio she'd carried with her. She found a lot. Letters, documents, testimony from people who remembered your father's promise to my grandmother. She even found some of Jake Morrison's early records that showed he'd been involved in covering up the truth. Jake Morrison, Emma knew about his role in this. She suspected he was the one who'd convinced your father to break his word. She found evidence that Jake had been stealing from the ranch even back then, skimming money and blaming shortfalls on payments to former employees like my grandmother. Silas felt a cold rage building in his chest. Jake Morrison hadn't just betrayed his current trust. He'd been manipulating the Ward family for decades, turning father against conscience and keeping the truth buried to protect his own criminal activities. Why didn't Emma come forward with this evidence? Ruth's expression grew sad. She was going to. She'd planned to return to the ranch in spring with everything she'd gathered. But the fever outbreak hit our community in February, and she was one of the first to fall ill. My grandmother and I nursed her for 2 weeks, but she died knowing I might never learn the truth. No, Ruth said firmly. She died knowing that someday justice would come. She made my grandmother promise that when I was old enough to understand, I would bring all her evidence to you. She said you were a good man who'd lost his way, and that good men could always find their way back if someone showed them the path. The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the cabin's single window, Silas could see torches moving up the mountain trail, at least 6 riders, moving with the deliberate pace of hunters who knew their quarry was trapped. "Jake found us," Ruth whispered. Silas moved to the window and confirmed his worst fears. Jake Morrison led the group, and the men with him were armed and spread out to prevent escape. They'd been tracked despite their careful efforts to hide. "Their trail. There's a back way out through the old mine shaft," Silas said quietly. "It connects to a trail that leads down the other side of the mountain. But we'll have to move fast." "Mr. Ward," Ruth said urgently, "there's something else Emma found. Something that proves Jake Morrison killed a man to keep his secrets." She pulled a document from the portfolio, a sheriff's report dated 3 years earlier about a ranch hand named Miguel Santos, who'd supposedly died in an accident. But Emma's notes in the margin told a different story. Santos had discovered Jake's rustling operation and threatened to expose it. Emma believed Jake Morrison murdered this man and made it look like an accident. She found witnesses who said Santos was planning to go to the territorial authorities the day before he died. The implications were staggering. Jake Morrison wasn't just a thief. He was a killer who eliminated threats to his operation, which meant both Silas and Ruth were in immediate mortal danger. "Boss Ward!" Jake's voice carried clearly through the night air. "I know you're in there. Come on out and let's talk about this like reasonable men." Silas checked his revolver and moved toward the back of the cabin where a narrow door led to the old mine entrance. "Ruth, take Emma's evidence and get out of here. Follow the mine shaft to the far exit and get to town. Find someone who'll listen to the truth. I'm not leaving you. This isn't your fight anymore. You have what you came for. Proof of your family's claim and evidence of Jake's crimes. Take it to the authorities." "It became my fight the moment they put me in that cellar," Ruth replied with quiet determination. "Besides, Emma made me promise to see this through to the end. I won't break my word to her." Jake's voice came again, closer now. You got 10 minutes to come out peaceful. After that, we're coming in, and there won't be any talking. Silas looked at Ruth, this remarkable young woman who carried herself with such dignity despite everything she'd endured, and saw Emma's determination reflected in her eyes. His daughter had found her purpose in trying to right his family's wrongs, and now Ruth was prepared to finish what Emma had started. Then we face this together, Silas said. But first, you need to know, I'm proud to have been chosen to help. You reclaim your family's honor, and I'm grateful that Emma's final years were spent with people who loved her, as she deserved to be loved. Ruth smiled through her fear. She said you'd understand when the time came. She said the best part of you was just buried under years of pain, and that all it needed was the right person to help dig it out. As they prepared to face whatever Jake Morrison had planned, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of righteous purpose that burned away doubt and fear. Emma had died trying to restore justice to the Ward name, and Ruth had risked everything to complete that mission. Now it was time to prove worthy of the faith both of them had placed in his capacity for redemption. The mine shaft behind the cabin was darker than Silas remembered, carved into the mountainside during his father's brief experiment with silver extraction. The tunnel stretched for nearly a quarter-mile through solid rock before emerging on the far side of the ridge, but navigating it without light would be treacherous. Stay close and keep one hand on the wall, Silas whispered to Ruth as they entered. The narrow passage. Behind them, Jake Morrison's demands had grown more threatening, and the sound of splintering wood suggested his men were breaking down the cabin door. The mine had been abandoned so long that sections of the ceiling had collapsed, creating obstacles they had to navigate by feel alone. Ruth moved with remarkable composure despite the danger, her breathing steady and controlled. She'd faced enough hardship in her young life to understand that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. How much further? She whispered, after they'd been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Should be seeing light soon, Silas replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. The mine had seemed much shorter when he'd explored it as a boy, but memory had a way of compressing distances. A faint glow ahead confirmed his hope. The exit emerged behind a screen of pine branches that had grown across the opening, providing natural camouflage. Silas pushed through carefully, checking to ensure no one was waiting in ambush. The far side of the mountain offered a panoramic view of the ranch spread out below. From this vantage point, they could see the lights of Jake Morrison's operation at the old mine site, the glow from the main ranch buildings, and the torches of the search party that had now spread out to cover multiple escape routes. He's got more men than I realized, Silas observed grimly. That's not just ranch hands down there. Some of those riders came from elsewhere. Ruth studied the pattern of lights below. He's been planning this for a while. Look how they're positioned. They've got all the main trails covered. Silas felt a surge of admiration for her tactical awareness. You have a good eye for strategy. My father taught me to play chess. He said it was important to understand how power moves across a battlefield, even if the battlefield was just a board with wooden pieces. They made their way down the mountainside carefully, using deer trails and natural cover to avoid detection. Silas's mind was working through possibilities, drawing on military skills he hadn't used since his brief service during the Indian Wars 20 years earlier. Back then, he'd been a cavalry lieutenant, responsible for reconnaissance and small unit tactics. The skills felt rusty but not forgotten. We need to get to the main house, he said. There's something there I'll need if we're going to have any chance against Jake's operation. What kind of something? My father's cavalry saber. It's been hanging on the study wall for years, but it's more than decoration. There's a hidden compartment in the handle that contains documents my father kept for emergencies, including a commission from the territorial governor giving him authority to act as a special deputy in cases of organized crime. Ruth looked puzzled. Your father was a lawman? Not officially, but during the early territorial days, legitimate authorities were scarce. Men like my father were sometimes given emergency powers to deal with situations the regular sheriff couldn't handle. If that commission is still valid, it would give me legal authority to arrest Jake Morrison and his men. The approach to the main house required crossing open ground that left them exposed to observation. But Jake's men seemed focused on the mountain areas where they assumed their quarry was hiding. The ranch buildings appeared lightly guarded, with only one man visible near the barn. "That's Tom Brady," Silas whispered as they crept closer. "I thought he was loyal. But if he's working with Jake now—" "Wait," Ruth interrupted. "Look at his posture. He's not guarding, he's hiding." She was right. Tom wasn't patrolling or watching for intruders. He was pressed against the barn wall, occasionally peering around the corner toward the bunkhouse where lights and voices suggested ongoing activity. They approached Tom carefully, and his relief at seeing Silas was evident and genuine. "Thank God," Tom whispered. "I've been trying to figure out how to warn you. Jake's got most of the men convinced you've lost your mind over that girl, and he's planning something terrible." "How many are with him?" "About half the regular hands, plus 6 or 7 outsiders he brought in today. But boss, some of the boys are just scared. They don't know what Jake's really been doing. They think this is just about keeping their jobs. And the others?" Tom's expression darkened. "The others have been part of his operation for months, maybe years. They're not just ranch hands anymore. They're criminals who'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." "Can you get us into the house without being seen?" "I think so. Mrs. Patterson barricaded herself in the kitchen, and Jake's men haven't bothered her. They're more interested in finding you than searching the house again." They made it to the house through the kitchen entrance, where Mrs. Patterson greeted them with a mixture of relief and terror. "They've been through here twice looking for evidence," she reported. "Tore the place apart worse than before." Silas's study was indeed in chaos, but Jake's men had still failed to find the hidden compartment. The cavalry saber hung in its accustomed place on the wall, its brass fittings tarnished with age, but the blade still sharp. Silas removed it carefully and found the concealed mechanism in the handle that released a small scroll of papers. The territorial commission was there, signed by Governor Potts and dated 1875. But more importantly, there was a letter from the territorial marshal authorizing Jeremiah Ward to investigate and prosecute crimes involving stolen government property. "This gives me legal authority," Silas explained to Ruth. "Jake's operation involves theft of government supplies, which makes it a federal crime. I can act with full legal backing, but you still need evidence that will stand up in court. That's where Emma's research comes in. Combined with what I've seen of Jake's operation, we have enough to make charges stick." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison leading a larger group toward the house, their torches creating a menacing glow in the darkness. "He's done waiting," Tom observed. "Looks like he's bringing everyone for a final sweep." Silas felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could try to escape again, taking Ruth to safety while Jake's crimes continued unchecked. Or he could make a stand here, using his father's authority and Emma's evidence to end Jake's operation once and for all. But it wasn't really a choice. Emma had died trying to expose the truth, and Ruth had risked everything to complete her mission. Running away would betray both their sacrifices. "Tom, I need you to do something," Silas said. "Take the fastest horse and ride to town. Find Marshal Stevens and tell him we have a federal crime in progress. Tell him to bring deputies and come prepared for armed resistance." "What about you?" "Ruth and I are going to end this tonight, one way or another." After Tom disappeared into the darkness, Silas turned to Ruth. She was examining Emma's portfolio of evidence with the focus of someone preparing for battle. "You know you don't have to stay," he said gently. "You've done everything your grandmother asked of you. You've reclaimed your family's honor." "No," Ruth replied firmly. "My family's honor isn't just about getting our land back. It's about seeing justice done. Emma died fighting for what was right, and I won't abandon that fight when it matters most." Silas strapped the cavalry saber to his side, feeling its familiar weight. The last time he'd worn it, he'd been leading a patrol against cattle thieves, threatening territorial settlements. The irony that he was facing the same type of criminals decades later wasn't lost on him. "Ruth, if things go badly tonight, I want you to know, having you here, learning about Emma's final years, discovering what she was trying to accomplish, it's given my life meaning again. Whatever happens, you've already succeeded in honoring both your grandmother's memory and Emma's sacrifice." Ruth smiled with a composure that reminded him powerfully of his daughter. "Emma told my grandmother that the Ward family had good hearts buried under layers of pain and pride. She said all they needed was the right circumstances to remember who they really were." Jake Morrison's voice boomed across the ranch yard. "Silas Ward, I know you're in there. Come out now, and we can settle this peaceful. You've got 5 minutes. Before I burn the house down around you." Silas checked his revolver one final time and moved toward the front door. The cavalry saber felt reassuring against his hip, a reminder of the man he'd been before grief and guilt had made him passive. "Are you ready?" he asked Ruth. She clutched Emma's portfolio against her chest like armor. "I've been ready since the day my grandmother made me promise to seek justice instead of revenge. Emma's evidence and my family's deed, that's all the weapon we need." As they prepared to face Jake Morrison and his men, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced since Emma's disappearance, absolute certainty about the rightness of his cause. Tonight would determine whether the Ward name would be associated with justice or corruption, whether Ruth would reclaim her inheritance or lose everything her family had fought for. But regardless of the outcome, Silas knew he was finally living up to the man Emma had believed he could become. Silas opened the front door of the ranch house and stepped onto the porch with deliberate calm, the cavalry saber visible at his side and his revolver holstered but ready. Ruth stood behind him. In the doorway, Emma's portfolio clutched in her hands like a shield of truth against the circle of armed men surrounding the house. Jake Morrison sat his horse 20 feet away, flanked by a dozen riders whose faces were a mixture of familiar ranch hands and dangerous strangers. The torchlight cast dancing shadows across their features, making them look like specters risen from some violent past. Well, Jake said with mock geniality, "the prodigal boss returns. Though I have to say, Silas, you're looking a little worse for wear. Running around in the mountains isn't agreeing with you." "Jake Morrison," Silas replied formally, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned as a cavalry officer. "By the power vested in me by the territorial governor and the federal marshal's office, I'm placing you under arrest for cattle rustling, theft of government property, and murder." Jake's laughter was harsh and genuine. "Arrest? You think you can arrest me? Look around, old man. I've got a dozen guns pointed at you, and you've got a rusty sword and a little girl for backup. I've got the law on my side, and the truth." "The law?" Jake spat into the dirt. "The law is what men with power say it is, and right now I'm the one with power." Ruth stepped forward slightly, raising the portfolio. "We have evidence of everything you've done. Documents proving my family's claim to the land, records of your criminal activities, and proof that you murdered Miguel Santos to keep him quiet." Several of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably at the mention of Santos. He'd been well liked among the crew, and his supposed accident had never sat right with many of them. "That's enough talk," Jake snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Bill, Charlie, take the girl and burn those papers. The old man can watch his precious evidence go up in smoke before we finish this." 2 riders spurred their horses forward, but Silas was already moving. Years of military training kicked in as he drew his revolver with practiced speed, putting 2 quick shots into the ground directly in front of the advancing horses. The animals reared and shied, throwing their riders' aim off and buying precious seconds. "Ruth, the signal lantern!" Silas shouted, diving sideways off the porch as bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing. Ruth understood immediately. The large signal lantern that hung from the porch beam had been used for decades to communicate across the valley. 1 flash for help needed, 2 for all clear, 3 for emergency. She grabbed the lantern and began swinging it in the pattern that would alert anyone watching from town that the ranch was under attack. Jake Morrison's curse was drowned out by the thunder of hooves as his men spread out to surround the house. But Silas had chosen his position carefully, using the porch and nearby outbuildings to create a defensive position that limited their angles of attack. "You always were too clever for your own good, Morrison," Silas called out from behind the water trough he'd taken cover behind. "But clever doesn't make up for being on the wrong side." "Wrong side?" Jake's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I built this ranch into what it is today. While you were off playing gentleman in Denver, I was here making the hard decisions, taking the risks that kept this place profitable. Profitable through theft and murder, profitable through vision. Your father was weak and you're weaker. Neither of you understood that survival requires strength, not sentiment." A shot from one of the strangers ricocheted off the metal trough, sending sparks flying. Silas returned fire carefully, making each bullet count. Military discipline had taught him patience. Wait for clear targets, conserve ammunition, think tactically rather than emotionally. Ruth had managed to signal the emergency pattern 3 times before one of Jake's men shot out the lantern. But the damage was done. Anyone watching from the valley would know the ranch was in trouble. "Boss!" Tom Brady's voice carried from the direction of the barn. "Marshall's coming up the road with a posse." The news changed the dynamic instantly. Jake's hired guns were criminals, not soldiers. They had no interest in facing federal law enforcement. Several of them were already edging toward escape routes. "Nobody leaves!" Jake roared, but his authority was cracking along with his composure. "We finish this now, or we all hang together." Silas saw his opportunity. Rising from cover with the cavalry saber drawn, he advanced toward Jake's position with the steady confidence of a man who'd faced down armed opponents before. "It's over, Jake. Your men are abandoning you. The law is coming, and the truth is about to see daylight. Surrender now, and you might live to stand trial." Jake Morrison's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You destroyed everything. All those years of building, of planning, of making this ranch matter. And you throw it away for some lying girl and her worthless papers. Those papers represent honor, Jake, something you never understood." Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Ruth's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Morrison," she called out clearly, "Miguel Santos had a family. Children who still don't know what really happened to their father. Don't make this worse than it already is." For a moment, Jake Morrison hesitated. In that instant of uncertainty, Silas saw not just a criminal, but a man who had chosen to let ambition poison his soul. It was a choice Silas himself might have made if Emma and Ruth hadn't shown him another path. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Marshal Stevens and his posse cresting the hill at a full gallop, their badges glinting in the torchlight. Jake Morrison's criminal empire was collapsing around him, and everyone present could see it. "Last chance, Jake," Silas said quietly. "End this with whatever dignity you have left." Jake Morrison's desperation manifested as pure rage. Instead of accepting defeat with dignity, he spurred his horse directly at Silas, drawing his gun with the wild abandon of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me," Jake roared, firing wildly as his horse charged across the ranch yard. Silas sidestepped the charge with practiced grace, bringing the cavalry saber up in a defensive position while his other hand steadied his revolver, but Jake's horse stumbled on the uneven ground, throwing the foreman's aim off and sending him tumbling into the dirt near the ranch house steps. Ruth saw Jake's gun skitter across the ground toward her position. Without hesitation, she darted forward and kicked the weapon away, even as Jake struggled to his feet with murder in his eyes. "You little—" Jake lunged toward Ruth, but found himself facing the point of Silas's saber. "That's far enough," Silas said with deadly calm. "Touch her and it'll be the last thing you ever do." The sound of Marshal Stevens' approach grew thunderous as his posse reached the ranch yard. Jake's remaining men were either fleeing into the darkness or throwing down their weapons in surrender. The ones who stayed were mostly legitimate ranch hands who'd been caught up in Jake's schemes without understanding their full scope. "Drop your weapons," Marshal Stevens commanded, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "This is a U.S. Marshal's operation." Jake Morrison looked around at the collapse of his criminal empire. His hired guns scattered to the wind, his loyal followers surrendering, his stolen cattle evidence of crimes that would see him hanged. But instead of surrender, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred focused entirely on Ruth. "This is all your fault," he snarled. "You and your grandmother's lies. None of this would have happened if you people had just stayed where you belonged." Ruth reached into her dress and withdrew something small, a simple wooden cross that hung from a cord around her neck. Her grandmother's cross, carved by Ruth's grandfather decades earlier. "My grandmother wore this cross every day of her life," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady despite the danger. "Even after your family stole our land, even after the sheriff refused to believe her, even after she lost everything, she never lost faith that justice would come eventually." "Justice?" Jake laughed bitterly. "There's no justice for people like you. There's only what strong men decide to take and what weak men are forced to give up." "You're wrong," Ruth replied. "There's truth, and truth doesn't care how strong or weak the people carrying it are. My grandmother kept the deed for 40 years, waiting for the right moment. Emma Ward searched for evidence of your crimes, even knowing it might cost her everything. And Mr. Ward chose to do what was right, even when it meant losing everything he thought mattered." Marshal Stevens and his men had surrounded the area now, their rifles trained on Jake Morrison, but Jake's attention remained fixed on Ruth with the obsessive focus of a man whose worldview was crumbling. "Your grandmother was nothing," Jake spat. "A servant who got ideas above her station, and you're nothing too. Just another lying thief trying to steal what belongs to better people." The words hit Ruth like physical blows, but she remained standing straight, her grandmother's cross clutched in her hand. "My grandmother was Sarah Jenkins, and she was worth 10 of you. She kept her dignity when you tried to steal it. She raised her family with love when you tried to break them with hate. And she taught me that people like you only have power as long as good people stay silent." Jake Morrison's final act of desperation came without warning. He produced a hidden knife from his boot and lunged at Ruth with the wild fury of a cornered animal. But Silas was already moving, years of military training combining with a father's protective instincts. The cavalry saber moved in a perfect arc, not to kill, but to disarm. The blade caught Jake's wrist with surgical precision, sending the knife spinning away as Jake screamed and fell to his knees. "It's over," Silas said firmly, pressing the saber's point to Jake's throat. "No more threats, no more violence, no more lies." Marshal Stevens approached with handcuffs ready. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for cattle rustling, theft of federal property, and murder. The territorial court will decide your fate." As Jake was dragged away, still cursing and threatening, several of the ranch hands approached Silas with obvious shame and uncertainty. "Boss," one of them said hesitantly, "we didn't know about the murder. We thought Jake was just—" "I know," Silas replied gently. "Jake Morrison was skilled at hiding his true nature, but now you have a choice. Stay and help rebuild this ranch the right way, or find employment elsewhere. There won't be any criminal activity here anymore." Tom Brady emerged from the barn, leading a group of hands who'd remained loyal throughout the crisis. "Most of the boys are good men, boss. They just got caught up in Jake's schemes without understanding what they were really part of." Ruth approached. Silas, Emma's portfolio still clutched in her hands along with her grandmother's cross. "What happens now?" "Now we do what should have been done 40 years ago," Silas replied. "We restore your family's land, we expose the truth about Jake Morrison's crimes, and we make sure justice is finally served." Marshal Stevens examined the evidence Ruth had preserved, Emma's research, the original deed, documentation of Jake's criminal network. This is enough to prosecute not just Morrison, but his entire operation. You've broken up one of the largest rustling rings in the territory. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Silas felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced since Emma's disappearance. The truth was, finally in the open, justice was being served, and the Ward name would be associated with honor rather than shame. Ruth stood beside him, her grandmother's cross catching the early morning light. She'd accomplished everything Sarah Jenkins had dreamed of, reclaiming their family's dignity, exposing the corruption that had oppressed them, and proving that truth was stronger than the power of those who tried to bury it. Your grandmother would be proud, Silas said softly. So would Emma, Ruth replied. She died believing that good people would eventually choose to do what was right. Today proved she was correct. 3 months after Jake Morrison's arrest, the territorial court had rendered its final judgment. Morrison himself was sentenced to hang for the murder of Miguel Santos, while his criminal associates received prison terms that would keep them off the range for decades. The stolen cattle had been returned to their rightful owners, and the government supplies found at the illegal operation had been restored to their intended destinations. But for Silas Ward, the most important legal document wasn't Jake Morrison's death warrant. It was the freshly written deed that lay on his study desk, bearing the official seal of the Territorial Land Office and transferring ownership of 200 acres along Willow Creek to Ruth Jenkins, heir to Sarah Jenkins and rightful claimant to the property. The document was beautifully crafted, written in careful script on heavy paper that would withstand the years ahead. It represented more than just a transfer of property. It was a restoration of honor, a correction of historical injustice, and a promise kept across generations. Ruth examined the deed with the same careful attention she'd given to her grandmother's original document, but her expression was peaceful rather than desperate. The frightened girl who'd been locked in a cellar had transformed into a confident young woman who owned valuable land and carried herself with the dignity her grandmother had always dreamed of seeing restored. "It's beautiful," she said softly, tracing the elegant lettering with her finger. "My grandmother would have wept to see this." "She can see it," Silas replied. "I'm certain of that." The legal resolution had been surprisingly smooth once the full scope of evidence was presented. Emma's meticulous research, combined with Silas's testimony and the supporting documentation found in his father's papers, had left no doubt about the legitimacy of Ruth's claim. Even the territorial governor had commented on the thoroughness of the case and the clear moral imperative to restore the stolen land. Ruth's inheritance was more valuable than anyone had initially realized. The creek access made the land ideal for grazing, but recent surveys had also revealed mineral deposits that could provide additional income for years to come. What Sarah Jenkins had been promised as compensation for faithful service had become a foundation for genuine prosperity. "What will you do with it?" Silas asked. Ruth looked out the study window toward the creek where her grandmother had once dreamed of raising her family. "I want to build a school there. A place where children of all backgrounds can learn together. My father always said education was the path to true freedom, and I think that land would be the perfect place to prove it." The idea stirred something deep in Silas's chest. Emma would have loved such a plan, a use for the land that honored both the past and the future, that transformed injustice into opportunity. "You'll need funding for such a project," he observed. "I've been thinking about that. The mineral rights could provide income, and I believe there are people who would support the idea of a school built on land reclaimed through justice rather than conquest." Silas opened his desk drawer and withdrew a folded document. "I've been thinking about that too. This is a proposal I'd like you to consider." Ruth read the paper with growing amazement. It was a partnership agreement offering to combine her inherited land with adjacent Ward Ranch property to create a larger educational facility. Silas was proposing to donate both land and funding to establish a school that would serve the entire territory. "You'd do this? Give up your own land for my school?" "It wouldn't be your school. It would be our school, a way to honor both Emma's memory and your grandmother's sacrifice, a place where children could learn that justice is possible, that truth matters more than power." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "What would you call it?" "I thought perhaps the Emma Ward Sarah Jenkins Academy," two names representing two women who refused to let injustice have the final word. The months following Jake Morrison's trial had seen significant changes throughout the ranch. The hands who'd been involved in criminal activities were long gone, replaced by men who understood they were working for an employer who valued honesty above profit. Tom Brady had been promoted to foreman, a position he'd earned through decades of quiet integrity. Mrs. Patterson had become more than a housekeeper. She'd assumed the role of unofficial ranch manager, overseeing daily operations with the efficiency that had always characterized her work. Her maternal concern for Ruth had blossomed into genuine affection, and she'd appointed herself guardian of the girl's reputation and well-being. Most importantly, the ranch itself felt different. The atmosphere of hidden secrets and unspoken tensions had been replaced by honest conversation and transparent decision-making. Workers knew they could speak up about problems without fear of retaliation, and the business was conducted with the kind of integrity that attracted rather than repelled honest customers. Ruth had chosen to remain at the ranch house while her own property was being developed, and her presence had brought a vitality to the place that had been missing since Emma's disappearance. She helped Mrs. Patterson with household tasks, assisted Tom Brady with bookkeeping, and spent her evenings reading in the study where Emma had once planned her own attempts to right historical wrongs. "I've been thinking about Emma," Ruth said, one evening as they sat by the fire, "about the choices she made and the price she paid for standing up for what was right. What about them? She could have stayed here, could have lived comfortably by ignoring injustice. But she chose to leave everything behind rather than be part of something she believed was wrong. That took incredible courage." Silas nodded slowly. "It took more courage than I had at the time. I was so focused on preserving what my father had built that I couldn't see the cost of that preservation. But you see it now. Yes, I see it now. And I understand that some things are more important than preserving the past. Sometimes honoring the past means changing course entirely." Ruth picked up Emma's music box from the table beside her chair. The delicate melody of "Amazing Grace" filled the room with its haunting beauty, a reminder of redemption, possible even in the darkest circumstances. "My grandmother used to say that grace wasn't just about being forgiven. It was about becoming the person you were always meant to be. She said some people spend their whole lives running from their true selves, but grace gives them the chance to come home. Is that what this feels like to you? Coming home?" Ruth considered the question carefully. "It feels like completing a journey that my grandmother started 40 years ago. She planted seeds of justice and faith, and now we're finally seeing the harvest." As autumn settled over the ranch, bringing the crisp air and golden light that made Montana beautiful, Silas felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since his youth. The land that had once been a burden of shame had become a source of pride. The legacy that had once felt tainted by his father's failures had been transformed into something worthy of preservation and respect. Most importantly, he'd discovered that redemption wasn't just about making amends for past wrongs. It was about choosing to live differently, to be guided by conscience rather than convenience, to value relationships over profit. Ruth's school was scheduled to break ground in the spring, funded by a combination of mineral revenue, territorial education grants, and donations from supporters throughout the region. The plans called for a substantial building capable of housing both day students and boarding students from distant areas, with a curriculum that emphasized both practical skills and moral education. But the school was just the beginning. Ruth had already begun corresponding with other advocates for educational reform, and there was talk of establishing similar institutions throughout the territory. The land that Sarah Jenkins had been promised as compensation for faithful service was becoming the foundation for changes that would benefit children for generations. "Your grandmother's faith was justified," Silas observed, as they reviewed the school plans together. "She believed that justice would eventually come, and she was right." "She was right about more than justice," Ruth replied. "She was right about redemption. She always said that people could change, that good hearts could overcome bad choices, if they were given the chance." Looking at Ruth now, poised, confident and gracious despite everything she'd endured, Silas understood that he'd been given more than just the chance to correct his family's historical injustices. He'd been given the opportunity to become a better man, to live up to the potential that Emma had always seen in him. The new deed lay framed on the study wall, alongside Emma's photograph and Sarah Jenkins's letters, documents that told the story of suffering transformed into triumph, of justice delayed but not denied. It was a legacy worth preserving, a story worth telling, and a foundation upon which better futures could be built. As the first snow began to fall outside the study window, Silas felt the peace that comes from work completed and honor restored. The lantern light that had guided them through their darkest hours had given way to the steady glow of truth revealed and justice served.